Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. Remember those overhead of handling navigation within your Android app, dealing with Fragment Manager and the Fragment Transaction APIs? What if I told you there is a more simplified way to manage navigation between your app screens and activities? The navigation component is a comprehensive framework in Android that simplifies the navigation between your app screens or destinations, such as fragments or activities. It provides a structured, easy-to-use, and consistent way to manage the navigation flow within your app. The navigation component presents a visual navigation graph defined within an XML file, allowing you to effortlessly map out your app's navigation. Within this graph, you identify destinations, which represent screens, such as activities or fragments. Connecting these destinations are actions, which point to how screens transition from one to another. These actions can also carry arguments, enabling seamless data transfer between screens. To ensure the integrity of this data exchange, the navigation component includes a feature called SafeArgs, short for type safe arguments, ensuring that the data passing between fragments or activities remains type safe and compiler checked, eliminating runtime exceptions. The framework also provides automatic management of the fragment transaction and the backstack, which is entirely customizable if you need to change the default behavior. And as a bonus, the framework helps you to seamlessly apply animations when navigating between different screens and takes care of something called deep linking, which is going to be discussed in future videos. Now, to use the framework, you need to include the necessary dependencies, create and integrate the navigation graph, employ a NavHostFragment as a container for the fragment replacement, and finally, utilize the nav controller to orchestrate the navigation flow across your app various screens. So we're back here to Android Studio, and the first thing we need to include is the dependency or the library. So here we go to the build.gradle module file, and we include the library within the dependency block. I will leave this dependency within the description below. So here, paste the dependency and sync the project. Now once it's done, we're going to take a look at our fragments. So I've already created 3 fragments here and set up their binding within these fragments. And for the layout, they're just pretty simple layouts. The first fragment has only a button that takes to the second fragment, and the second fragment has a button and a bunch of edit text to navigate with arguments to the third fragment. And lastly, the last fragment is just empty. We will use it to show a toast message with the arguments that we got from the second fragment. Now, the next step is to create the Nav Graph. So here under res, right-click, new Android resource file. We are going to create a new directory of type navigation. And for the file name, we are just going to name it navigation. Once you're done, click OK. So here within the navigation graph, it's pretty simple to the layout which we are used to in XML file. So we have split mode, we have the code mode for the navigation graph, but for simplicity, we are going to use the design tab, and feel free if you want to take a look at the code once we finish. Now, how to add destinations within this graph. You can see here we have to click on this icon and it just shows you all the screens within your app. You can see here the main activity and a bunch of other fragments. Now, as you may know, the navigation component works with activities and fragments, so you can use it to navigate from one activity to another or one fragment to another. But in this video, we are going to use it to navigate between fragments. So let's add our fragments to the navigation graph. I'm going to first add the first fragment, then the second fragment, and the third fragment. Now, the first fragment that you added to the navigation graph will have this icon here, which shows that this fragment is going to be the home fragment or the first fragment that shows up once you launch your application. If you want to change that and make, for example, the second fragment to be the home or the default screen, you can right-click and choose this option here, set as start destination. Now, we want to add the actions that connect these screens. So here, the home fragment should go to the second fragment. Take this dot and grab it and attach it to the second fragment. Similarly, for the second fragment, we want to navigate to the third fragment, so take it and attach it to the third fragment. Now, for each screen or each destination, if you click on it within the attribute tab, you can see it has an ID, label, and name, and here you can add arguments, and we are going to see how this works. And for the actions as well, they have other attributes like animations, arguments, and the pop behavior, which we are going to customize later. Now let's go to the third step, is to add the NavHostFragment. So within our main activity, let's go to the main activity layout. Here we have to add a fragment container view, and within that fragment container view, we are going to specify the NavHostFragment. So let's do that. Fragment container view is going to match the whole parent, so match. And here we have to specify the name. And you can see here, it shows you all your fragments, but if we added a fragment here, it's going to be static, it's not going to be changed dynamically, and it's always going to be there within the screen. So instead of this, we have to add the NavHostFragment. So you can get that with androidx.navigation.fragment.navHostFragment. And then we have to also attach our Nav Graph to the fragment container view. So add app, Nav Graph, it doesn't show up by default, so we have to type that yourself. Add navigation, add the navigation graph. Now to make it more readable, I will rename the navigation file here, or the navigation graph file, to navigation graph, nav graph for short, so we can differentiate between the file and the directory. And finally, don't forget to add the closing tag for the fragment container view. Now without doing anything, let's run the app to see how would it look like after adding all these parts together. Well, the app crashed because we have to add an ID to the fragment container view. So this is essential to access the NavHostFragment, which is the class that is responsible for replacing the fragments, and also to access the nav controller, which we are going to use to manage the navigation between different fragments. So here I'm going to give it an ID of fragment container view, and now I'm going to run again. Here you can see it just shows the first fragment by default. So now we are going to go to the first fragment, here, first fragment, and we are going to add a click listener to the button within that fragment. So use binding.firstButton or first fragment btn.sit on click listener. And now the way to access the nav controller within fragments is by using the find nav controller function. And as I've talked about this before, the nav controller is used to manage or orchestrate the navigation flow across the app. And here we are going to use it to navigate to the second fragment. Now it has a bunch of overloads that we can use to navigate. Currently, we are going to use the one that takes an ID resource. But what is this ID resource? If you go back to the Nav Graph, you can see here that each action that takes us to another screen has an ID. You can see here it starts with action, first fragment, which is the current screen, then 2, then the target screen, which is the second fragment. So we're going to use this ID to navigate to the desired screen. Back to the first fragment, here r.id.action, first fragment to the second fragment. As simple as that. Now let's run to see how it works. Now if you click to the button, it takes us to the second fragment. Now similarly, let's do this within our second fragment. So let's go to our second fragment, and here we are going to add a click listener to the button within our second fragment. But in this case, we also have to pass some arguments, the name, age, and occupation. So let's get the text from each of those. Here, val name equal to binding.nameEt.text to string. Again for the age, HET, and finally for the occupation. And here again, find nav controller dot navigate r.id.action, and you can see here we want action second fragment to third fragment. In this case, we want to navigate to the third fragment, and we have to pass all of these arguments. But we didn't specify that the third fragment takes some arguments. Let's specify that within our nav graph. So here, if you click on the third fragment, under arguments section, you can add arguments to this screen. Here we want to add 3 arguments. All of them are strings. The first one is the name. It's going to be a string. If you would like to pass the age as an integer, you can also do that by choosing integer. In this case, I'm just using string. You can also specify if it's nullable. So the third fragment can launch without having this value. And you can also specify if it's an array of type string, not just a string. And you can pass a default value for this argument. In this case, I'll leave all of these empty, and again, make another one for the age is going to be string, and lastly for the occupation, it's a string as well. Now back to the second fragment. Here, as the second argument of the navigate function, we are going to pass a bundle. So before that, let's create a bundle here first. So val args is going to be bundle of, and here name is going to set to the name that we got from the text view. Then age is going to set to the age. And finally, the occupation is going to be set to the occupation. And here we can simply pass the bundle. Now within our third fragment, we have to get these arguments and show it to the user, so we know that we navigated with arguments. So how we can do this? So we can simply do this by using the require arguments function. So here I'm going to say val name equal to require arguments function, or require arguments dot get. And here you can use the function that represents the data type that you passed. In this case, we passed 3 strings, so get string, and for each string we are going to pass the key. So we used name for the name, and age for the age, and occupation for occupation. So pass the same key, make sure the keys are matched, otherwise you're going to get a null value. And finally here we want to show a toast. So it requires context, use the required context within fragments, and here we are going to show the name, age is age, occupation is occupation. And now let's run. So here, click on the second fragment. Within the second fragment, add the data. So Astro 22 tuber, for example, and go to with args. Here you can see it shows the data that we passed from the second fragment. We navigated with arguments to the third activity, but it's still kind of tedious to match the type and the name of the keys that we passed from the second activity. What if we are, for example, we're mistaken with a single letter within this key? Then we're going to get a null value. But if also we mistakenly choose another type for our arguments. So for this, we're going to use a plugin from the navigation component library, which is called the SafeArgs. So let's add this plugin within our Android project. So the first thing we want to do is to go to the build.gradle file, not the module one, but the project file. Here we are going to add the SafeArgs plugin. I'll also leave this in the description below. So underneath this, add the SafeArgs plugin. Make sure it has the same version as our library here, our dependency. And finally, on top of the module file, build.gradle module file, here within the plugins block, add the ID of this plugin. And the last step is to sync the project. Now let's go to our second fragment and see how we can get rid of this code right here. So what does the plugin actually do? It's similar to the view binding. It generates classes that represent every action within your Nav Graph. So here, this action is going to be represented within a class that has some arguments. So here what we are going to do is we are going to replace this ID with the class generated for this particular action. So here, the class is always named after the class name. So second fragment is going to be second fragment direction. Here you can see second fragment directions. If you add the dot, you can see here, it gives you a function that represents the action. So action second fragment to third fragment. And if you click Ctrl P, you can see here that it takes 3 strings. So it's pretty much simpler than specifying the bundle, and sometimes you just miss a single argument, or sometimes you have multiple arguments that are pretty cumbersome to specify. So SafeArgs is a very handy and very helpful feature of this library. So here, let's pass the name, the age, and the occupation. Now we can simply get rid of this args bundle. And now within the third fragment, we have to get access to these arguments. Here within the third fragment, we can do this by creating a val args by navArgs. And here we have to specify to which class do these arguments belong to. In this case, these arguments belong to the third fragment. So here, I'm going to say third fragment args. Now finally, instead of using the required arguments, we are going to use the args variable here. So let's get rid of those. And here, val name.args, age.args, and occupation.args. Don't forget to add the parentheses. And now you are set to go. The great thing about the safeargs, it is so dynamic. So if you added another argument to the third fragment, for example, ASD, or whatever, give it a type and make it nullable so you don't have to pass it. Here, if you go to the third fragment and type args dot, you can see that the ASD, or whatever has been already generated for us. So it's much better to use the safeargs rather than passing the arguments as a bundle. Now let's discover animations within the library. So the library gives you a seamless experience with controlling the animations whenever you navigate between different fragments. All you have to do is to specify the animation to your actions. So here within the Nav Graph, click on the action, and then you can choose the enter animation, exit animation, pop enter animation, and the pop exit animation as well. So let's play around with the enter animation. If you press Ctrl space, you can see here the different animations that you can add to your action. So in this case, I'm going to add a fade in animation whenever we go to the second fragment, and fade out whenever we leave the second fragment or pop the backstack or click the back button. So fade out animation. Now similarly for the second action that takes us to the third activity or third fragment, the enter animation is going to be slide in right, and this one is going to be slide in or slide out left. This one is going to be slide in left, and this one is going to be slide out right. Now let's run to see how this works. So here you can see once we navigate to the second activity, it adds some fade in animation, and now if you go to the third activity, you can see a slide in left animation. But if we now navigate back or pop the backstack, you can see that we leave the app completely. Well, this is because we have to specify the NavHostFragment or the nav container view or fragment container view as the default nav graph of this application. So to do this, we have to add this attribute, default nav host, default nav host, and set this to true. Now, if you run and navigate through the fragments, once we navigate back or pop the backstack, you can see that the fragments are added to the backstack automatically, and we can navigate back from these fragments. Here we are within the second fragment, click back, we go back to the first fragment. Now, the last thing that I want to show you about this library is that you can also control the top app bar, which is this one right here, dynamically according to the currently presenting fragment. So we have to add some code within the main activity. Here, we'll first get the nav host from the fragment container view. So val nav host equal to support fragment manager dot find fragment by ID. And I've talked about this before. It gets the current fragment from the fragment container view, but in this case, we are getting the nav host fragment. So r.id.fragment container view, and now we are casting this to a nav host fragment. Now, once we get the nav host fragment, we can simply get the nav controller, which is responsible for navigating between fragments. So nav controller equal to nav host fragment or nav host dot nav controller. Now, once we do this, we have to call a function called setup action bar with nav controller. But this function is not directly included within this library. It is included within another dependency of the same library. So for this, I will add this dependency here within our build.module file. This dependency here is responsible for the UI part of the navigation library. Now let's sync and go back to the main activity. And here we are going to call the function set up action bar with nav controller. You can see here it takes a nav controller, so pass the nav controller. Now I named this to nav config, should be nav controller instead, so make it nav controller. And now let's run to see the toolbar bar changing dynamically according to the currently showing fragment. So here you can see that the fragment first is showing because the fragment first is actually showing. Go to the second activity, you can see the fragment second now as the title of the toolbar bar. You can see the toolbar bar now has a back button. When you click on it, goes to the previous fragment, but in this case it doesn't work, and we're gonna see how we will make this work. Now go to the third fragment, and it changes dynamically according to the fragment. Now, if you are wondering how you can change the title, this title, or where does this title come from, it comes from the Nav Graph. As you can see here, each destination has a couple of attributes: ID, label, names, and other arguments, and so on. So the title here comes from the label. So if you want to change this title, all you have to do is just to change the label. So first fragment is going to be first, for example. I'm going to name it the first. The second is second. The third is going to be third. And before we run, let's add the functionality to the back button, this one. So let's go to the main activity again, and here we are going to override a function called onSupportNavigateUp. Now, onSupportNavigateUp is responsible for what happens when you click on the back button here within the top app bar. So what we want is to navigate back to the previous fragment. So to do this, we have to again get access to the nav controller. So nav controller equal to find nav controller, and the find nav controller within activities actually takes an ID of the fragment container view, which is within our main activity layout. So here, pass fragment container view, and finally we want to return nav controller.navigateUp, and now it will just simply go back to the previous activity. So let's run to test the fragment label and the button that takes us to the previous fragment. Here you can see that fragment label is changed correspondingly to the current fragment. And now if you click on the back button, it takes you back to the previous fragment. Now the last thing that I want to show you is about the backstack. Here, the normal behavior of the backstack is pretty simple. Go to the second fragment, go to the third fragment, and once you click back or hit the back button on the top app bar, it takes you to the previous fragment. But if you want to change this behavior, you can simply do that within the Nav Graph. Here, for each action, you can specify what happens when you pop the backstack or go back to the previous screen. So click on the action, for example, this one that takes you to the third fragment, and here you can specify where you actually want to go. So whenever I'm within the third fragment, I want to change the behavior to go to the first fragment. So in this case, I will choose the first fragment. And now if we run, whenever we are within the third fragment and we hit the back button, we go to the first fragment directly without having to visit the second fragment. So here you can see first fragment, second fragment, third fragment. Now if you hit the back button, it takes us to the first fragment directly, like so. And if you want to leave the app whenever you go to the first fragment, all you have to do is to make it inclusive, as inclusive will completely pop the backstack, including your specified destination. So in this case, it will pop all the fragments, including the first fragment from the backstack. Let's go again to try this out. Here, let's go to the third fragment and go back. You can see it leaves the app completely, as it popped all the fragments from the backstack, including your specified fragment. So that was it for the first part of the navigation component framework. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.